It's been 7 years since the devastating massacre, and families of victims are still seeking answers. The Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa, together with other organizations, is on a mission to demand justice for these families. Manda Makwarela from the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa joins me in studio. Manda, good evening. Thank you very much for your time. Perhaps just by way of introduction, you can just take us back. Over the past few years, what has SERI and the sister organizations you've been working with sort of been trying to do with victims and their families?
So SERI represents 36 of the families of the deceased miners, and the initial representation was with the Commission of Inquiry that was set up. It lasted about... So during the Commission of Inquiry, SERI represented the families and made sure that those victims' voices were heard. There was a lot of pushback to having the families issue their statements and to explain the impact of the death of their loved ones. SERI was instrumental in making sure that those impact statements were presented in front of the Commission and that the impact of that loss was actually heard. The Commission ended, recommendations were passed, and one of the recommendations, for example, was to have an expert panel of policing create a report on public order policing in South Africa. Throughout that time, SERI continued to engage with the state on negotiations. So we're talking about the loss of husbands, we're talking about the loss of fathers, we're talking about the loss of sole breadwinners. During this time, from the 13th to the 16th, people's entire incomes were devastated. You were talking about families where a mother, a widow, would have to step into her husband's place and become the sole breadwinner. Children would have to step up and become the heads of household and become the sole breadwinners for their families. So we were pushing initially to have these people compensated for the losses they had. In the meantime, we were also pushing for the prosecutions to occur because of the 37 miners that died during that period, no one had been prosecuted. In the past year or so, there has been a push to prosecute police for the deaths that occurred, for some deaths that occurred on the 13th, and for the failure of the police to come forth about the death that occurred on the 16th of a miner who died in the back of a police car.
Now, I mean, a day like this sort of gives us an opportunity to perhaps interrogate some of the things that have happened, some of which, perhaps never made sense when they were happening, but now sort of when you put everything together, some have started to make sense. I want to start with the pushback you were talking about in the run-up to the commission of, to the Farlam inquiry. Having looked at everything that has happened, what in your view, what do you think were the reasons for some people to push back and to try and get these families to submit statements and not really get to hear their actual voices? Upon reflection.
I think what was interesting was the way in which the striking miners were presented to South Africans. We were talking about people who were in very difficult working conditions, and all they were asking for was the ability to negotiate for a higher wage. And that's it, right? So we were talking about protesters who were just trying to exercise their constitutionally protected right to protest, who were then killed. And so I think if you start from that point, you then recognize the injustice that these families have had to endure. So their loved ones have died. They've lost sole breadwinners in many instances. Their husbands' fathers are being characterized as maniacs or whatever language was used to describe them. It had to, I mean, SERI got involved, but it had to become a change in the narrative about the way that people who died protesting for a living wage were portrayed. And so for them to be able to talk about their loved ones, to explain that, this person loved soccer, called their parents or family 3 times a week, was sending this one to school, was building a house for this one, it was so important for the commission to understand that what had happened was a catastrophic loss of life at the hands of the state.
And did you ever get to understand what it was that those who were pushing back were trying to do?
Unfortunately, I'm I'm not privy to that information, the motivations, the motives.
But what was your reading of it?
I think in a lot of instances there was a fundamental misunderstanding of what happened during that time. I mean, this was a protest that just started as a group of miners sitting, not even in their employer's space, outside of the mine shaft area, sitting, asking to negotiate. And it got, I think there was perhaps, it got a lot of national attention, and perhaps there was a push to make sure that that didn't become an embarrassment, or a push that it didn't. I honestly cannot imagine what.
Now, the inquiry then took place. I mean, these workers got to be heard, and a whole lot of other people's voices were, of course, heard during the course that it ran. And very specific recommendations were made. I was listening to Judge Farlam this morning talking to us, and of course obviously expressing his disappointment at the fact that, you know, a lot of the recommendations still haven't been implemented. Have you ever been able to sort of put your finger on it and understand why the state has been tardy as it has been in actually implementing the recommendations of the inquiry?
I honestly have absolutely no idea. I mean, so where the recommendations have been implemented, for example, with that public order policing expert panel report, when the recommendations came out in 2015, 2016, this panel was convened, a report was written, and it was submitted to the Minister of Police in 2018. It still hasn't been released. So even where the recommendations are taken up, nothing has come of them. With those recommendations, the recommendations were meant to ensure that another Marikana does not happen. And so right now, we are in a state where public order policing, tactical response teams, there's this blurred line as to who is policing protest and how is that policing of protest, you know, peaceful, not to, how that policing of protest is happening. And so what we're seeing in numerous instances is that police are going into protest situations not fully trained, not understanding how they're supposed to engage with protesters who have, again, a constitutionally protected right to protest, and the outcomes are becoming increasingly negative. So I'm not sure why these recommendations haven't been implemented, but we are continuing to see the repercussions of that failure to implement.
Of course, I mean, although, I mean, the police minister was sitting right where you're sitting now, and he did say that they've gone some way in implementing. He even came with numbers as to how many, you know, public order policing people have been trained, and acknowledging also that one of the biggest mistakes that were made was to take special units that were never trained for public order policing, and saying, of course, that they have begun to address that. I suppose, I mean, we journalists have a duty to actually interrogate those numbers and find out if indeed that is what happened. But I want us to fast forward and now talk about obviously the families want justice, and we saw this week that some of the people who were involved, yes, it's a handful, have appeared in court. But from the work that you've been doing, what is your program now? What are you focusing on, and what are the most important things that you and the families believe need to happen now?
So, I mean, the families are still fighting to get compensation from the state. What was offered, essentially, to each family was 500,000 rand, but the state specified that that did not include constitutional damages. So it's, in a sense, not acknowledging the violation of the family's constitutional rights in this sense. So we are still pushing for compensation that includes constitutional damages, and that is at 2 million rand a family. So it's...
But why is that important?
One, past practice. So the state has shown a willingness to pay amounts in that range. Two, to recognize this is the most intense violation of human rights in post-apartheid history in South Africa. It will remain a blemish on the soul and the spirit of South Africa until there is an apology, until there is a recognition of the harm that was caused to the families, to the communities, and to the country as a whole. And part of that will come from the government, one, issuing an official apology, which still hasn't happened, and two, the payment of compensation that will recognize or show that there was damage caused to these families, and an amount that is what is expected by the families, is what they want.
Where is that process now, as we speak?
At this point, the government did offer 500,000 rand, but that did not include constitutional damages.
So it's been rejected?
It has been rejected because it is, so there's a continuing negotiation process because we want the constitutional damages. So we are continuing to be in negotiations with the state with the proviso that it needs to include constitutional damages.
Are there timelines?
It's been...
Or deadlines?
At this point, none that I can share, none that I can be sure of, but it's been 7 years. So as we continue to go through this process, I think it continues to add almost insult to injury, that this process is continuing to go on and these families are continuing to be dragged through the process of having to demand compensation for some that they should have received years ago.
At what point are you going to say, enough is enough, there's been too much talk over the past 7 years and very little movement. Let's take the next step.
The next steps are being taken in various ways. So while we're arguing for compensation, we're also arguing and pushing for this never to happen again. So we're advocating for, one, prosecution of the police who were involved in the killings on the 16th of August. So 34 minors died, not a single person has been prosecuted for those deaths. And at the same time, we're pushing for a review of how policing in South Africa is done. And I'm sure that the minister had interesting numbers. It would be great if he shared them. It would also be great if the report that was officially requested through the Farnham Commission was released, that they've been sitting on for a year, was released.
Are you focusing only on the conversations with the state, or are you also engaging Lonmin, for example?
So the people who were killed, the miners who were killed by the South African Police Service. So we are currently...
I'm talking now about on the sort of broader socio-economic issues, not specifically the deaths.
That would be a question for the attorneys representing the families.
Okay, thank you very much for coming through.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Manda Makwarela from the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa.